And I think we should probably start with Hugo Larsson from Eintracht Frankfurt. We have good Eintracht Frankfurt news. We have bad Eintracht Frankfurt news, I guess. Hugo Larsson heavily linked to Borussia Dortmund and Brighton. I can only say this, Frankfurt have a player linked up already in Love Arhoff, who's coming on right from Denmark, who can play in a very similar role. We both suspect that Frankfurt will do quite a bit in the transfer window in January because of the latest results that they've been having. In the league, they haven't been convincing. The squad needs a little bit of a reshuffle. We're going to talk about the lack of a center forward option in a moment as well, and the player that they are potentially bringing in or trying to bring in. And so, with that in mind, I'm not too shocked that they are probably going to think of maybe moving some pieces out. And Hugo Larsson has been perpetually linked with a transfer away from Eintracht Frankfurt for quite some time. Dortmund is one club that are looking at him. I'm not sure that is the biggest need. And the other club is Brighton. And Brighton, for me, I looked at this story and I thought, yeah, that actually makes a lot of sense, Stefan.
Yeah, Hugo Larsson's an interesting one. As you said, a great player for Frankfurt, but perhaps probably the most kind of sellable asset for them going into this kind of January transfer window, at least in midfield. There's been a lot of change, obviously, in recent months at Frankfurt. They've got guys like Schiri in there, but they've also got Højlund. They've also got Mahmoud Dahoud, who's kind of playing a more prominent role. Mario Götze, who's kind of the elder statesman in that midfield. But the most obvious one is obviously Can Ozun. Now, I know Ozun's probably more of a kind of number 10 or can play off the wing, but he's also technically a kind of midfielder. And to an extent, has maybe been kind of taking minutes off Hugo Larsson for much of the season. And yeah, it'll be interesting to see kind of where Larsson goes from here. I think he's a player with immense amount of potential, but perhaps also a player, Manu, whose profile has maybe been slightly inflated because, the club he plays for, his age, he's kind of seen as this really impressive Swedish talent at 21 years of age. Still maybe trying to kind of come to terms of what kind of a player he is. I think at times he can play as number 10, at times he can play as a kind of holding playmaker, or even as a box-to-box midfielder, but he's kind of had a very stop-start season at Frankfurt. He was out at the start of the season with flu. He's also missed 3 or 4 of last Frankfurt games with, muscle injuries, and he hasn't really hit the ground running for Frankfurt, I would say, this season, been quite unimpressive. Maybe factors out with his control. But, considering the changes that happened at Frankfurt this season, there's a lot of kind of young players that you're waiting to see who was going to step up and kind of take on a more prominent role. And that hasn't really happened with Hugo Larsson this season. So maybe a move is an ideal one. And, we're talking about Brighton and Dortmund as the two kind of front runners to sign him in January. And It makes sense, it certainly does make sense. I think for a start, Brighton obviously know the Bundesliga very well. They do very well with picking up players from the Bundesliga and then kind of polishing them up and then selling them on to bigger clubs in England or abroad. I think with Larsson, though, it'd be interesting to see how much Brighton think they could get Larsson for, because obviously with Brighton, it's always a case of signing players with the intention of selling them on. If it's 30 or 40 million euros, then okay, fair enough. Mm-hmm. That's the kind of gives them enough kind of leeway, or gives them enough margin, if you will, to kind of make a decent profit. If he has a good couple of seasons at Brighton, then they can sell him on for 70 or 80 million euros. But if Frankfurt kind of put their foot down and say, no, we know the value of this guy, we want 56 million euros, then I'd be quite surprised if Brighton still went ahead with that. Equally, Dortmund is an interesting one as well. Now, I think this would actually maybe be a smart sign for all parties involved. Dortmund do need midfielders. I know they kind of already signed Bellingham in the summer, but I just don't think that's really working out as well as they kind of hoped it would. There's a lot of pressure on the kid to kind of be the kind of answer to all their problems. A, because he's called Bellingham, and B, because he's a record signing. And I just don't think that's really worked out very well. So, I think they probably do need more kind of recruits in January, not just in midfield, but across that pitch, really. And, Hugo Larsson's obviously a young talent that has proved himself the Bundesliga, so he might be a smart sign for them. But equally, I can't see Dortmund getting him for anything less than the record transfer fee they paid for Bellingham, so it'd be a huge signing as well. So, I can absolutely see Frankfurt selling him on Manu, but whether Brighton or Dortmund would be willing to pay what Frankfurt want for him in January, I think is a huge ask for both those clubs right now.
Well, and also like he's just signed a new long-term contract, right? That's the other thing to keep in mind. So the fact that he's under contract until 2029, I don't think there's an exit clause there. Man City have been sniffing around this player as well for some time as well. The fact that he hasn't been performing as well this season as he did in previous years, I think is something that you have to remember as well. You mentioned the problems with his fitness, etc. But I think the Dortmund link, as you alluded to, is really fascinating here because when you look at the moment Rudy have in that position, right? There's Felix Nemcha who's been playing well this year, but Emre Can, he's now playing as a center back mostly, and that's been an issue and a story that we have well documented on this podcast, I think. And then you have, of course, Joe Bellingham, and I think I spoke with Dan about this on the main show earlier this week, and we were talking about how the expectations in him are just too high at the moment. He's a young player who came from a second division and is still learning his trades, and he's obviously not ready yet for this level, right? And so Hugo Larsson can play at this level. He has shown it at Eintracht Frankfurt, and I think he's actually, when you really think about it, he would be quite a logical signing. But market value 40 million euros, Stefan, he would probably be a record signing for Borussia Dortmund at this point. And I know this from talking to people at Eintracht Frankfurt, they're kind of reluctant to sell players to their direct rivals, whether it's Bayern Munich or Dortmund.
Well, yeah, exactly. So I think Dortmund would, that's kind of what I was saying, Dortmund would probably end up paying through the nose for him. I guess it really comes down to how much Frankfurt rate Larsson, and I think this kind of goes back to what I was saying, that he hasn't had the best start to the season. He's been overshadowed in midfield by Can Uzun. They've obviously got other guys in there as well. Maybe not in midfield per se, they're still kind of relying on kind of older faces like, Dahoud and Mario Götze, but and Shaqiri as well, I suppose. And I think Frankfurt, to be perfectly honest with you, probably do need to actually maybe invest in some midfielders because it is a little kind of top heavy, that team, and some central defenders, but I won't go into that. But they've got Højlund in there who's doing very well, and Can Uzun. So maybe Frankfurt are saying, they're obviously very good at selling at the peak of a player's kind of profile, if you want to put it that way. And maybe they're thinking this is Larsson's highest profile. I think, was it Roma he was linked with in the summer, if my memory serves me right? So they probably know a lot of clubs will be coming in for him, and they might say, this is the best time to sell him. I think they would sell him to Dortmund at the right price, but it depends whether they think he's a guy who's eventually going to be worth 80 or 90 million euros to a Liverpool or a Chelsea, or they think, okay, maybe this guy's not actually as good as the buzz around him, so we'll sell him now before that's the case. And Frankfurt are very shrewd in these things, so I think it will come down entirely to their opinion on him, if you will, and whether they'll be willing to sell to Dortmund or Brighton. But I don't know, Manu. I'm kind of waffling a bit here, admittedly, because even I'm not entirely sure what I think of Hugo Larsson. I think he has had really good moments in a Frankfurt shirt, but sometimes I think with players like this, they look better on paper than they maybe are in real life. So I think he still has a long way to go to prove himself as like a kind of classic or a top Bundesliga player. So I don't know. I'm quite wary. I think the two clubs that have been linked with so far, Brighton and Dortmund, are two clubs that would be very wary of spending more than like 40 million euros on him. So that's why I'm a little suspicious of these rumours and whether it would work out, even though I think it could work out very well for a club like Dortmund, who maybe do need a player like that. But equally, Dortmund need strikers and they need wing backs and things like that. And to go out and spend 40 or 50 million euros on Larsson, particularly in January, makes very little sense to me. So yeah, we'll see what happens with it.